Welcome to Fairfield County Talks Housing, a program of Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity. Fairfield County Talks Housing is a forum for fact-based conversation on housing and zoning issues with experts and leaders in the field. I'm Evonne Klein, and I'm your host and founder of Fairfield County Talks Housing. Today, we are launching a new in-depth series, Fairfield County Talks Housing One-on-One, and we're here today at the state capitol to talk one-on-one with House Majority Leader Jason Rojas. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us today,
Sure.
House Majority Leader. It's always great to spend time with you and to talk about some of our favorite topics,
Yes.
which are housing, and zoning in the state of Connecticut.
Yep.
So just briefly, housing has been a priority of yours for quite a while.
Right.
And if you could just tell us why housing is a priority for you.
Yeah, I mean, I see it as being central to the quality of life for people in their lives. Housing is key to the kind of the health of a family. And once you have the health of a family, now you have the health of a neighborhood. Once you have that, you have the health of an entire community. And then from there, it's the health of the state. So I think housing is key to the health of people at all levels. And we're certainly in a crisis. And I think we've seen over the last couple of months where there's been kind of a national spotlight placed on it. There was a reference to housing by President Obama at the DNC, and certainly Vice President Harris has a component where she's focused on housing as well too. So I think it's good that it's gotten more attention because, as you alluded to, I've been at this for a while. I think housing is the kind of thing you can take for granted. Right? If you're comfortable in your housing, if you're stable in your housing, it's not something you really think about too much. But it's also probably the key driver to the cost of living in a place like Connecticut. And I don't know that people look at it that way. And we certainly haven't allowed the supply of housing to be developed in the way that we need. We haven't allowed the diversity of housing to be developed in the way that we need. And if we're going to be focused on the health of our families, the health of our communities, and the health of our state, we really need to be thinking about our housing policy.
So I'd like to go to one of your quotes from the end of the 2024 legislative session. And you had said, I call it painfully incremental progress, not to diminish the things we do every year, but it certainly did not rise to the moment. I'm more worried about how things will look 10 years from now. So let's talk about the moment here in Connecticut. Homelessness in Connecticut is up.
Right.
For the first time in, I could easily say a decade, we're seeing families living in their cars,
Right.
who are unsheltered. And that was something in Connecticut that we were always proud of,
Right.
that no family went unsheltered in Connecticut, but unfortunately it's happening now. The cost of housing is skyrocketing.
Yep.
And as you alluded to, we were in a housing crisis prior to this,
Right.
prior to the pandemic. So, and I would easily say about 10 plus years ago, Connecticut really began investing in a very bold way in building housing and affordable housing. So why are we here? Why are our housing challenges worsening? And what are the obstacles to helping individuals and families find a safe, stable, and affordable home?
Yeah. And it's funny, that quote, I get reminded of that quote all the time. And I probably said it at the end of 23 session, and I probably said it at the end of the 22 session too, which I think really reflects how I feel about this issue. I've been reminded that we have made some progress. There are a lot of good things happening with housing, but I don't have a lot of patience for the pace that we're moving at, only because, as you know, it takes a long time to propose to build housing, to get your financing lined up, to get the land secured. So before you even get a unit built, you're talking about 2 or 3 years. So my urgency comes from a place of what's Connecticut and housing going to look like 10 years from now if we don't start acting now. And that's why I get frustrated and, I say quotes like painfully incremental progress. So there's progress being made there and we should celebrate it. but I don't think anybody should be comfortable with where we are in terms of moving it. And then, unfortunately, it's not unique to Connecticut, right? This is a national issue. There are some states who are doing a bit better on housing policy. There are some states that have done a lot more in the last 2 or 3 years to address the housing shortage. And to answer your question directly, it is simply a shortage. It's a shortage of overall supply. I think it's also a shortage of a diversity of housing. When I forget the statistics, 78% of the land in our country is zoned for single family zoning, single family housing only. So when you have that kind of obstacle, and when you're developing housing, time is money. And so when you have to go through the process of trying to get approval for multifamily housing, even duplexes and triplexes and quads, right? I think most people think of housing and they think about large apartment complexes, which I think is what causes the most concern for communities and for towns and for local leaders. But you can't even build duplexes and triplexes. And when you limit supply, right, it's like economics 101. When there's a limited supply of something and a lot of people are looking for it, the price is going to go up for it. And I think that's what we're seeing right now is inaction on the part of lawmakers at the local level, at the state level, and the federal level of the last 10, 20, 30 years. And we've gotten to a point where there is demand for housing. People are more mobile now. We have people who are working from home and therefore can live in different places. Connecticut is an attractive place to live for all sorts of reasons. Despite being expensive, we have a high quality of life. We have great education. We have great natural resources. We have great access to Boston and New York. People want to live here, but there's simply no place to find a place to go. And even for those who might want to sell, given the inflated cost of housing right now, even if you have an empty nester with a whatever kind of house that they might have, they can sell it, but where are they going to go? Because they likely want to downsize to an apartment or to a condo, and we just haven't allowed enough of those to be built.
Great, thank you. So there's a perception that, and it's out in communities, right, by regular folks who are working hard every day, right, making a living, supporting their families. So out in communities, there's a perception that last session was a disappointment when it came to making progress and passing legislation. And that would really help these folks, right, who are working hard and struggling to afford their homes. So whether it was just cause, which dealt with causal for evictions, not being called for a vote, or even a zoning bill for transit-oriented development in communities, we all called it work, live, ride, passing in the House and never being called in the Senate. So there was, and other bills that caused frustration. So despite, the widespread agreement, that Connecticut is in a housing crisis and the nation is in a housing crisis, it seems that legislative progress is not being made. So it sort of makes no sense, right? On one hand, we have a crisis. On the other hand, we're not
responding to it.
Solutions, right? Yeah. So what are some of your thoughts on why we aren't able to get those bills called and get those votes on key pieces of housing legislation?
Yeah, I mean, housing policy has always been subject to kind of the political headwinds that we face. And certainly here in Connecticut, it's been politicized, right? There are lots of folks out there, and it's not just Republicans, but it doesn't help when Republicans are 100% lockstep opposed to doing just about anything on housing. But we also have a number of Democrats who haven't been able to get on board with trying to move a housing agenda that'll result in the kind of outcomes that we're looking for. And it's largely because, one, it's dealt at the local level. And in Connecticut, everything is kind of done at the micro level, at the town level. A lot of those decisions are made there. I think a lot of people who currently own a home are acting rationally when they fear that something that might happen in their community is going to impact the value of their home. That's logical. We know that the research shows that even when apartments are built or multifamily housing is built near a neighborhood, it doesn't actually decrease the value of anybody's properties. And in many cases, it actually increases the value of that property. So like a lot of complicated policy issues in housing is one. Because of all of the different components that have to go into making housing happen, whether it's accessibility to land, access to infrastructure, getting the financing lined up, having the construction industry that can actually build homes and having the workers. It's really complicated, but you add in that political element on on something that is any family's biggest investment, right? Buying a house is likely the biggest investment any average person will make. They want to protect it. And I think when you inject the politics and you have people engaging in the kind of rhetoric that we've seen here in Connecticut, where they put out pictures on social media that this policy is going to mean that an apartment tower is going to be built in your single family home, naturally that's going to scare people. And I think legislators respond to what they see as a political liability. Let's just be honest about it, right? It's the politics of it and the political liability that doing something on housing might cause for them. And it's unfortunate. I would say we need a little bit more courage on the part of policymakers, but I also understand, as a politician myself, I understand those fears. And it's a little different for me to say it because I'm in a relatively safe seat. I've been here a long time. Chances are I'm going to get reelected. When you're saying that to somebody who has picked up a seat in a more purple district, particularly down in Fairfield County, where a lot of those seats have been held by Republicans for generations, they've suddenly swung Democrat. Doesn't mean they're a safe seat Democrat. There are folks who are going to act a little bit differently in the building, or be a bit more cautious. And I want to believe my colleagues when they say my constituents are opposed to this. I have to believe them, right? I have to take them at their word. So we need a lot more people to be engaged in the process and to inform themselves about what it means to move an agenda on housing policy and educate the public so that they can then respond and say something to their legislator about, hey, this is a good idea. Hey, I do support this. Or at a minimum, hey, I'm not opposed to this.
We've heard a lot about the fiscal guardrails.
Yes.
And just really throughout the year and highlighted during, obviously, legislative session.
Right.
So what impact do the fiscal guardrails have on our ability or your ability to tackle changes and the challenges of Connecticut's housing crisis? And what can be done to address this challenge?
Yeah, no, certainly the guardrails were put in place for many good reasons, and there's been a lot of good outcomes to that. The other side of the ledger means that we can invest more in housing vouchers, right? If we can't get the physical affordable housing built, how do we get more resources into the hands of families so that they can go afford an apartment that does exist? And that comes in the form of vouchers, right, or RAP certificates. And we haven't invested any money in those programs. We know that there's a huge waiting list of people who want to get access to a voucher. But even when you get access to a voucher, there's limitations to that as a policy solution, because where are they going to go? And that housing voucher is only going to, cover a certain part of a rent. But when rents are so expensive because of a lack of supply, the vouchers are limited. But the guardrails don't allow us to invest more resources in a program like that. Most of the money that we do have in the budget is on the bonded side of the agenda, and there is a guardrail on bonding. But the Malloy administration and certainly the Lamont administration have put a lot of bonded resources into housing, and that's a benefit, right? We're seeing housing get built. We need housing of all types. Even market rate housing needs to be built, right? Not just affordable, so that at the macro level we can begin to see the price of either the cost of a home come down or the cost of rent to come down. And we know, through economic analysis, that that's what happens when you put more supply into a marketplace.
What needs to be done in order to move legislators to cast their votes for solid housing and zoning policies that will have a positive impact on Connecticut's housing crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to find bipartisan solutions, right? I mean, that is what's keeping us from getting the votes that we need. If we can get some Republicans on board with some things, that means we don't have to have every Democrat voting for something. But I think there needs to be, the Majority Leader Roundtable, I think, has been a great opportunity for us to sit off session, off season, because when we're in session, things are so crazed. Members are on multiple committees. They have all sorts of demands on their time. It's often hard to focus on something as critical as housing policy. So in the off session, it gives us the opportunity to meet and to have conversations in a bit more private setting. It allows people, I think, to share ideas more freely without the cameras being on, without the media completely being around us, even though they can sit in on our meetings. It's a different environment. And we found, I think we're building more trust. And I think we need to do that. I think we need the citizenry to be more educated on this issue. We need to be more engaged on the issue. And there are ideas out there. I think we have to continue to socialize them within the legislature and within the public. Nothing ever happens in the first or second year. It takes a long time to pass major policy proposals in a place like this, and I don't think it's unique to Connecticut. So I think one, we have to have legislators who are courageous, who put the ideas out there. We have to have legislators who are open to that debate. We have to have voters and taxpayers who are open to that debate. And I think, while painfully incremental, we'll be able to make a little bit of that progress and come to some compromise, which I think we saw a little bit of that last year, where we made some changes to 8-30G, which is a kind of a third rail topic here in Connecticut. But we changed it a little bit, where we're going to give towns some points towards a moratorium. Not exactly the goal that I think towns should be having to reach a moratorium, as opposed to just having a goal of developing more housing. But if they move forward with zoning for middle housing, they're going to get a little bit more credit towards that 8-30G moratorium. And we got Republican support for that. So I think it's coming up, thinking about the current policies that are in place, evaluating whether the best policies that we have in place, and then being courageous about making changes to things that perhaps some groups in this building hold sacrosanct, right? Like, they don't want to make any changes on it. They don't want to compromise. I think this is a situation where we're just going to have to.
A couple of follow-ups.
Yeah.
I'll start with the majority leaders roundtable.
Right.
So with the session coming up in several months,
Right.
Do you foresee any legislation coming out of your roundtable discussions that you'll be having?
Yeah,
is that a goal of yours?
Yeah, it always is, right? And I mean, we still have ideas from our first year of the roundtable that I think we need to explore. I mean, there are some things that are in motion right now. Fair share wasn't necessarily a component of the majority leaders roundtable, but that analysis is being done. It's likely we're going to revisit that in the next legislative session. In the current year, I think because it's an election year, quite frankly, legislators in particular, are really busy, either working their jobs and then running for re-election. So I think it's hard to have those as meetings that have the kind of participation that I think we need for the roundtable to be as successful as it can be. So there's, we're looking at municipal design review. We had a meeting and looking at that and seeing how that plays a role in limiting our ability to develop housing. So I don't know that there's anything specifically that'll come out of the roundtable this year, but there is work from the first year that I think will be brought back and we'll consider when the legislature convenes in January.
I'd like to just go back to something you had brought up about 830G, the Affordable Housing Appeals Act. And, certainly it is contentious in many of Connecticut communities, and folks are always looking to make changes. And just to remind people why that act is there is to encourage the development of affordable housing by private contractors, if we go way back to the beginning, and to ensure that communities are developing affordable housing for people of low and moderate income. So that's why the act is there.
Right.
This year, some changes to 830G, some would arguably say weren't so great.
Yeah.
We're going to see some communities in the state receive a moratorium.
Right.
Which means that for 4 years they are exempt from a developer using the act to build affordable housing. And I really don't want to pick on a community per se, but we may see a couple of communities in Connecticut exempt from building affordable housing. One I know absolutely for 4 years, another one for 8 years. And some of those communities are in the heart of Fairfield County, where housing is, I think, the most expensive in the state. So how do you respond to folks who are concerned that the need isn't being filled and that this wasn't a great change to the act?
Yeah, I think it remains to be seen. Two communities receiving a moratorium, I don't know that that's the end of the world. They're likely some of the communities that have been the most obstinate to doing something on this. And it doesn't absolve them of the responsibility to move on developing more housing or affordable housing. What it does is not make them subject to 8-30G, which allows a developer to petition to court to approve a project, right? So it doesn't completely absolve them of that responsibility. That was my proposal. I struggled with it as well, but it came from a place of being in this building for 16 years and seeing this annual fight about 8-30G, which is largely a red herring, in my opinion, in the larger debate around housing policy. It makes people uncomfortable that they don't have complete local control over their decision making. An issue, but not the primary issue that we should be focused on. But it sucks up so much air in this building. And I saw us continuing to focus on 8-30G as opposed to talking about other things around housing policy. And I wondered if there's an opportunity here. So if towns do move forward with zoning as of right for middle housing, right, duplexes, is that a win? In my opinion, it's a win. Not everybody agrees with me on that, and I'm okay with that. But if we do see towns to move, and that was a big goal of mine, getting towns to do things as of right without it being a single family home. I think there's a policy victory in that. Is there a downside to us not feeling good about on New Canaan getting a moratorium, given the fight that they've put up? And certainly this is Representative O'Day's proposal that he came forward with. He represents New Canaan. That is a cost, a short-term cost I was willing to bear if we're going to see some other kind of zoning changes at the local level that move us in a different direction around middle housing.
If you could, I love the magic wand questions.
Yeah.
So if you could wave a magic wand, what would you like to see happen to address Connecticut's housing crisis?
Yeah, I would love a magic wand as well, too. I mean, the easiest thing that we could do, if I had a magic wand, because it's not easy, is for local land use decision makers, local legislative bodies, mayors, to make the changes within their zoning regulations that allow for more housing to be built. Different types of housing, multifamily housing, low income, middle income, market rate. They can do that now for free, and not totally free. It takes time, it takes some money. But that's not anything that I wish the state could legislate it. I don't think we have the political support for it, but it's something that can be done for free immediately that would result in the kind of changes that we're looking for.
What can we do to support and affect change?
Yeah. One, if you're listening to this, you already made a step in it, and that you care and you're educating yourself about this issue. Two, coming out when you're for something as opposed to only coming out when you're opposed to something. And that's what we usually see at these public hearings at the local level. It's largely the people who are opposed to things as opposed to the people who are for things. And what a far more positive way to look at an issue like this, to come out and be for something as opposed to just being opposed to it. And then communicating with your local land use decision makers, communicating with your state legislator, and letting them know that, you know what, I think it's okay to act and make some progress on this. I don't think it's going to negatively impact me in the way that I think it's going to. But that only comes about through education, through having civil discourse, to not making assumptions about what people's motivations are, but sitting down and talking to this thing, right? I think that's the democratic process, small d. Or was it large D, small d? You'll figure it out. You know what I meant. Not the partisan democratic process. How's that? But people really getting engaged on this issue and understanding how critical housing is to their own personal lives, but also to the quality of life for their community.
Great. So let's talk about a little bit about as of right. And as of right does not mean you can build anything anywhere.
That's right.
So that's number one.
Often misunderstood.
So let's just put that to rest.
The town is still very much in control, even with as of right.
That's correct.
Right.
And with respect to local control, I like to think of it in terms of local authority, because decisions are being made by people elected or appointed who live within that specific community. And all of that authority is given to local communities through 8-2, the Zoning Enabling Act, right? Which allows municipalities to form planning and zoning commissions and all of that.
So they can really only do things that the state allows them to do.
Correct.
Right.
So, so this local control notion, as I said, I'd like to think of it more as you have a local authority, and to reassure communities that decisions are being made locally by their own folks who live there. So I think that's important. In 8-2, it actually says that municipalities must, which is a requirement, right? Must zone for multifamily housing and must provide housing for low and moderate income families and individuals. So that's background, very wonky. But as of right, many communities, like New Canaan, for example, has as of right to build multifamily actually quite near to their downtown. There is a zone. But in Connecticut, 91% of our land is zoned for housing, for single family
Right.
housing. And single family housing is as of right in every single Connecticut community.
Right.
So, so pushing on this as of right notion, could you talk a little bit from your perspective when you push on it from a duplex, triplex idea? Let's talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, it should be as easy to build a two-family home, and it's not easy because it's hard to build housing, right? But the process shouldn't be as burdensome for a duplex or a triplex or a quad as it is for a single-family home, especially when, in many cases, it's largely same square footage, right? We have a lot of large homes throughout Connecticut, right? 5,000 square foot homes. Well, you could probably build 4 units of housing in the same footprint of it. So, it's really about just making the process easier. I think it helps remove the politics from the process because we know what happens when a developer who wants to do something that's not as of right has to go before their local land use board. That's when 5 or 6 people who are maybe just concerned neighbors or 5, 6 people who are just agitators show up at a hearing and express their opposition. And then those local decision makers who are either elected or appointed kind of have the same political concerns that perhaps a legislator has, react to those 5 or 6 voices and deny something or delay something or make it really more expensive. And the only people who pay for that are the actually end user, right? The person who wants to buy a home and live the American dream, or the person who's looking for a more affordable multifamily unit who's trying to take care of their family. So trying to remove all of those different veto points, I think, is more productive for the process and allows more housing to get built.
And I think you raise an interesting point that the end user is the one who is really affected.
Right.
And oftentimes it's children
Yeah.
of those folks who'd like to return to the place
Yeah.
where they grew up, but
Right.
they can't afford it.
Right.
Or those folks themselves when it's time for them really to, not live in that 4-bedroom house
Downsize.
anymore.
Yeah.
And
But want to stay in their
downsize.
community that they
Yep.
love. There's nowhere for them to go.
Yep.
So then they move, right? And what does that say about kind of the civic health, the community health, right? Those people are really invested in that community. And now they can't do that anymore because they don't have a place to live.
Well, thank you so much for
Sure.
joining us
Yeah,
today.
thank you.
You've certainly been a leader on this issue for a number of years, and we're excited to work with you and look forward, to the 2025
absolutely.
legislative session. So thank you again.